The wind was a blade, honed by distance and despair, cutting through the thin fabric of her coat, through bone to the marrow. Snow didn't fall here so much as it was torn from the bruised sky and flung horizontally, stinging like flung sand. Elara huddled deeper into the shallow gully, the meager warmth of her own body dwindling against the assault. Days blurred into a single, unending ache of hunger and the gnawing certainty that this was the end. Her past was a wound, left raw and bleeding by abandonment. Her future, this white, suffocating shroud. There was nothing left but the cold and the crushing weight of loneliness. She had tried to walk, to follow the distant smudge of mountains she hoped held salvation, but her strength had failed miles back. Now, she simply waited for the inevitable surrender of flesh to frost. Her breath plumed weakly, snatched away instantly by the wind. A sound, faint at first, then growing the creak of leather, the heavy snort of a horse laboring against the gale. Fear, sharp and primal, pierced through the lethargy of cold. She tried to press herself flatter into the earth, a futile attempt at invisibility. A dark shape materialized through the swirling snow, large and imposing. A man on a horse, bundled against the elements, face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. He stopped a few yards away, the horse shifting restlessly. He didn't speak, didn't approach immediately. He simply sat, observing the small, shivering form huddled in the snow. Elara couldn't read his expression in the gloom, only felt the weight of his gaze. Was he a threat? Another cruelty delivered by a world that seemed to specialize in them? Her hand instinctively went to the small, smooth stone she clutched, the only thing of substance she possessed. It offered no defense, only a small comfort against the vast emptiness. Finally, he dismounted, the snow crunching under his heavy boots. He moved with a quiet competence that spoke of belonging to this harsh place. He didn't offer a hand or words of pity. Instead, he knelt a safe distance away, pulling something from his saddlebag. A hunk of dark bread, cheese wrapped in cloth. He laid them on the snow between them. His voice, when he spoke, was low, rough-edged like the wind, but it didn't roar. "You'll freeze," he stated, not a question. Elara could only nod, her throat tight, tears freezing on her cheeks. She watched him, wary, ready to bolt if she had the strength. He stood, not looking at the food. His eyes, visible now, were the color of slate under a winter sky, watchful, remote. He gestured vaguely towards his horse, towards the faint trail he had followed. "Got a place," he said. "Warm." The word hung in the air, a siren song promising salvation. But it came with a price, didn't it? Everything did. She looked at the food, then back at him. The silence stretched, filled only by the shriek of the wind. He didn't press, didn't urge, just waited. In the face of utter desolation, his simple presence felt monumental. It wasn't kindness, not yet. It was an offer, stark and without flourish, born of necessity perhaps, or something she couldn't fathom. Her stomach cramped, a painful reminder of her desperate state. Survival clawed over pride, over fear. She reached trembling hands towards the food. As her fingers brushed the cold bread, his voice came again, quieter this time, barely audible above the storm's roar. It wasn't a question, wasn't a demand. It was something else, resonant in the vast, indifferent landscape. "Be mine forever," he whispered. The words hung in the brutal air, strange and heavy. Forever. In this moment, forever felt like simply surviving the next hour. She ate the bread, then the cheese, tearing at it with numb fingers. He watched her, silent, unmoving. The cold was still there, but the emptiness in her stomach was lessened, replaced by a different kind of fear, the fear of the unknown, of this man and the quiet, binding words he had spoken. Forever. The concept was too large, too abstract for her starving mind to grasp fully. It simply meant not dying alone in the snow. For now, that was enough. She rose slowly, every joint protesting, her legs unsteady. He waited, then turned and remounted his horse. He didn't offer a hand up, didn't speak further instruction. He simply began to ride, slowly, deliberately, assuming she would follow. And she did. What choice was there? The snow continued its relentless assault, but ahead of her, a dark shape moved, a silent guide through the storm. The world was still a cruel, indifferent place, but for this brief moment, she was not alone in it. The whisper echoed in her mind. A promise or a threat? She couldn't tell. Forever. The journey was a test of endurance, every step a battle against the deepening drifts and the wind that sought to rip her apart. He rode ahead, a silent, unhurried sentinel, occasionally glancing back to ensure she was still following. He didn't offer his horse, didn't slow more than necessary for her weary pace. It was a silent understanding. This was the price of the bread, the shelter. Survive the journey. When they finally reached his cabin, nestled in a shallow valley protected from the worst of the wind, it was less a home and more a fortification against the elements. Low slung, built of heavy logs, it seemed to sink into the earth, as if seeking refuge itself. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, a beacon of warmth in the desolate landscape. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and drying hides. It was sparse, clean, dominated by a large stone hearth where a fire roared. A rough-hewn table, a single chair, a cot covered with a thick wool blanket. That was all. He gestured towards the hearth. Dry yourself. He didn't offer conversation, didn't ask her name. He simply shed his heavy coat, revealing a frame that was lean and strong. He moved about the cabin with quiet purpose, tending the fire, checking supplies. Alara sank onto the floor near the hearth, holding her hands to the blessed heat. The ache in her limbs began to subside, replaced by a deep exhaustion. She watched him from under lowered brows. His face was weathered, lined, his movements economical. He seemed accustomed to solitude, to the quiet rhythm of his own company. He heated water in a pot over the fire, then poured it into a basin. He set it near her with a clean, rough towel. Vaish. Again, an instruction, not an offer. She nodded, grateful. The simple act of washing away the grime and stiffness of the journey felt like shedding a layer of her past. She was still Alara, but the raw edge of despair was beginning to soften, replaced by a tentative hope. He prepared a simple meal, stew simmered over the fire, thick with meat and root vegetables. They ate in silence at the table, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind outside. He ate slowly, deliberately, his gaze often fixed on the flames. She ate with a hunger that was still ravenous but tempered by the need to appear composed, not utterly destitute. The food was warm, nourishing, life-giving. When they finished, he cleared the dishes. He gestured towards the cot. You take the bed. I'll sleep by the fire. It was another quiet gesture, devoid of fanfare. He didn't act like a rescuer, more like a man stating simple fact. This was the arrangement. Shelter for what? The unspoken price of forever hung between them. A mystery. Did he expect labor? Companionship? Something more? Her fear had receded slightly with the warmth and food, replaced by a watchful uncertainty. She lay on the cot, the blanket rough but warm against her skin. She watched him settle near the fire, his rifle within easy reach. He was a man of this land, tough and self-reliant, and she was entirely at his mercy. The thought should have brought terror, but exhaustion was a powerful anesthetic. As she drifted towards sleep, she observed his profile silhouetted against the firelight. Stoic, remote, a man who had offered forever in the midst of a blizzard. A strange beginning to an uncertain future. The days that followed settled into a quiet, rigorous routine dictated by the demands of the land and the livestock he tended, a small herd of cattle hardy enough to survive the harsh winters. Alara quickly learned that his offer of shelter was contingent on her contribution. It wasn't stated in words, but implied in every shared task, every expectation. She helped with chores she had never imagined herself doing, hauling water, collecting firewood, mending fences, cleaning the small cabin. Her hands, once soft, grew calloused and strong. Her body, weakened by hunger, slowly regained its resilience. He was a silent teacher, correcting her movements with a gruff word or a quiet demonstration. He rarely offered praise, but his lack of complaint was its own form of affirmation. She learned to anticipate his needs, to read the subtle shifts in his mood, the tightening around his eyes that signaled worry about the herd, the slight relaxation of his shoulders when a task was completed. She learned his name was Silas. He never asked hers. It was as if her identity before him didn't matter, or perhaps didn't exist in this new life. She was simply the woman he had taken in. Trust grew slowly, like a stubborn root pushing through frozen earth. It wasn't built on shared confidences, there were none, but on shared labor, on the quiet rhythm of two people navigating a difficult world side by side. She saw his competence, his deep respect for the land and the animals, his quiet strength. She saw that he was fair, providing for her needs without extravagance, but never withholding essentials. He didn't pry into her past, didn't ask about the circumstances that had left her alone and near death. He simply accepted her presence, the unspoken agreement of forever, a silent backdrop to their days. One evening, while she was mending a torn sack near the fire, Silas was cleaning his rifle. The silence was comfortable, companionable in its lack of expectation. "Why?" she asked, the word surprising even herself. He paused, his eyes fixed on the rifle barrel. "Why what? Why did you take me in?" The phrase, "be mine forever," felt too loaded, too exposing to voice aloud. He finished wiping the barrel before answering, his voice low. "Didn't see fit to leave you for the wolves." It was a practical answer, devoid of sentiment, yet it held its own weight. A simple act of not allowing another living thing to perish needlessly. It wasn't rescue, not kindness in the traditional sense. It was a fundamental refusal to allow death on his watch, perhaps. Or perhaps, loneliness had etched its own silent plea into his being, one that recognized the same ache in her. She didn't press further. The answer was enough, revealing nothing and everything about the man. He was a creature of this land, driven by its harsh logic, its unspoken rules. And she was becoming one too, adapting, strengthening, finding a quiet sense of belonging not in sentiment, but in shared necessity. She was still vulnerable, still carried the scars of her past, but the constant edge of fear was dulling. She was learning to stand on her own 2 feet, even in the shadow of the man who had offered her a strange, silent future. The fragile peace of their shared existence was shattered by the arrival of riders. 3 of them, hard-faced men smelling of stale whiskey and malice. They rode up to the cabin at midday, their presence a blight on the clean snow. Alara, who had been hauling water from the frozen creek, froze. Silas stepped out onto the small porch, his rifle held loosely but purposefully. "What do you want, Thorn?" Silas's voice was flat, devoid of welcome. The leader, a man with a scarred face and cold eyes, grinned, revealing missing teeth. "Heard you got yourself a stray, Silas. Figured you might need help." Managing her, he spat chewing tobacco onto the snow near the porch steps. The other 2 men leered, their gazes raking over Alara. Fear, sharp and cold, lanced through her. This was the kind of cruelty she understood, the kind that had driven her to the brink. Silas didn't flinch. "She's not for sale, Thorn. Or for hire. Ride on." Thorn laughed, a harsh, unpleasant sound. "Everything's got a price, Silas. And everything out here belongs to someone, eventually. Maybe she belongs to us now." One of the men started to dismount. Silas raised his rifle, the movement smooth and practiced. "Get off my land," his voice was quiet, but held the absolute certainty of lethal intent. Thorn's grin faded. He eyed the rifle, then Silas's steady hand. "You always were a stubborn fool, Silas." Protecting strays, he paused, his eyes flicking towards Alara, a predatory gleam in them. "Maybe we'll come back when you're not so well guarded." He turned his horse sharply and rode off, his 2 companions following, casting backward glances filled with resentment and thwarted greed. Alara stood rooted to the spot, trembling. Silas didn't lower his rifle until they were specks against the horizon. He turned then, his gaze meeting hers. There was no softness in his expression, but something else she hadn't seen before, a fierce, quiet possessiveness. He wasn't just protecting his property, he was protecting her. "They won't try that again," he said, his voice rough. Alara found her voice, stronger than she expected. "Thank you." He nodded curtly. "They're scavengers. Look for weakness," he paused, then added, "You ain't weak." His words were a simple statement of fact, but they resonated deep within her. She wasn't weak. She had survived the snow, survived hunger, survived the journey, and now she had survived this threat, standing beside him. Her time here hadn't just been about enduring. It had been about rebuilding, piece by painful piece. She looked at Silas, seeing him not just as her rescuer, her provider, but as a partner in survival, a protector in a brutal world. The fear was still there, a low thrumming beneath her skin, but it was mingled now with something new, determination. She wouldn't be astray again. She would fight for her place, for this fragile toehold in existence. Later that evening, as the storm returned, rattling the cabin walls, they sat by the fire. The silence was different tonight, charged with the tension of the confrontation. Silas was sharpening a knife, his movements precise. Alara watched him, the memory of Thorn's leering face vivid in her mind. "They know I'm here now," she said softly. Silas stopped sharpening the knife. He looked at her, his slate-colored eyes steady. "Doesn't matter. This is where you are." He didn't ask if she wanted to leave, if she feared staying. It was assumed. This was her place, his place, their place now. In that quiet assertion, the full weight of his whispered "forever" from that first night began to settle. It wasn't a romantic vow, not a claim of ownership over a helpless soul. It was a statement of intent in a world where intentions were rarely spoken. He would keep her here, protect her, and she would belong. Belonging felt less like a cage and more like a shield. The threat had passed, but it had underscored the precariousness of their existence. It had also forged a new link between them, a shared understanding that went beyond the daily chores and silent meals. They were a unit now, small and isolated, but bound by necessity and a growing, unspoken loyalty. Alara looked around the small cabin, no longer seeing just a place of refuge from the cold, but a haven built by resilience and guarded by quiet strength. Her journey had led her here, stripped bare and vulnerable, but it was here, in this remote, harsh corner of the world, that she was beginning to find herself. The storm raged outside, a reminder of the world's indifference, but inside, by the firelight, a fragile warmth had taken root. Alara picked up the mendings again, her fingers working with newfound purpose. She was not astray. She was here, and for the first time in a long time, the future, uncertain as it was, felt less like a threat and more like a possibility. The man across the fire, the silent guardian who had offered forever in the face of annihilation, continued his work, a solid, unwavering presence. The winter deepened, testing the limits of their supplies and their patience. The external threat of men like Thorn receded, replaced by the constant, grinding challenge of nature itself. Blizzards trapped them for days, forcing them into closer proximity, their shared space shrinking. It was during these times, when the world outside ceased to exist beyond the cabin walls, that the unspoken bond between Alara and Silas deepened. Conversation remained sparse, focused on practicalities. The dwindling feed for the cattle, the state of the woodpile, the weather forecast etched in the clouds. Yet, within this enforced intimacy, they learned more about each other through actions and silences than words. Alara saw Silas's quiet worry during a prolonged storm, his meticulous care of his animals, his surprising gentleness when tending a small wound she received while chopping wood. He, in turn, witnessed her growing strength, her determination to contribute fully, her quiet resilience in the face of hardship that would break many. She no longer flinched at loud noises. Her eyes had lost their haunted look, replaced by a watchful awareness. She stood taller, moved with a quiet confidence. One evening, after a particularly difficult day digging out livestock from a drift, they sat by the fire, bone-weary. Silas was rubbing life back into his numb hands. Alara, without a word, brought him a basin of warm water she had heated. He looked up, surprised, then nodded his thanks. He soaked his hands in the water, his gaze distant. "Hard country," he murmured, not to her specifically, but to the fire. "Hard, but fair," Alara replied, thinking of the way the land demanded effort but rewarded it with sustenance, unlike the fickle cruelties of the world she had left behind. He looked at her then, a long, steady look that held a depth she hadn't seen before. The silence stretched, filled with the crackle of the fire. The air in the small cabin seemed to vibrate with unspoken things. Finally, his voice was low, rougher than usual. "Remember that first night?" Alara's heart gave a small jolt. The storm, the snow, the sheer despair. And his words. "Yes." He shifted, looking back at the fire. Said, "Be mine forever." It wasn't a question. It was a simple statement of fact, a repetition of the strange offer made in the jaws of the blizzard. He didn't elaborate, didn't explain. He simply brought the words back into the quiet warmth of the cabin. Alara looked at her hands, calloused and strong. She thought of the cabin that felt like a haven, the routine that had become a lifeline, the silent man across from her who had saved her life and asked for nothing explicit in return, only this quiet, shared existence. Forever no longer sounded like a prison sentence or a desperate plea. It sounded like belonging, not ownership but partnership. Not a cage, but a foundation built on mutual reliance and respect. She met his gaze. Her voice was steady, clear. "Yes, Silas. Forever." It wasn't a romantic declaration, but a quiet acceptance of a bond forged in hardship, a commitment to face the brutal world together. He held her gaze for another moment, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He didn't smile, didn't reach for her. It wasn't their way. But something in the air shifted, a palpable sense of two solitary lives finally finding a place to anchor. The winter eventually broke, giving way to a reluctant spring. The snow melted, the creeks swelled, and the land began to breathe again. Life on the ranch remained hard, a constant struggle against the elements and the isolation. But Alara was no longer just surviving. She was living. She worked the land alongside Silas, her body strong, her spirit resilient. The fear that had once defined her had been replaced by a quiet determination, a fierce protectiveness towards this life she had built from the brink of death. She was Alara, a woman who had been lost and found, broken and reforged. She carried the scars of her past, but they no longer dictated her future. She looked at Silas, riding ahead of her as they checked the fence lines, his figure solid against the vast sky. He was still a man of few words, still remote in many ways, but she saw the quiet strength in his profile, the competence in his hands, the unspoken understanding that passed between them with a shared glance. Their forever was not a fairy tale. It was a life built on necessity, carved from the wilderness, guarded by vigilance. It was shared burdens, silent companionship, mutual reliance. It was finding warmth in the cold, safety in isolation, and belonging in the quiet space between two souls who had nowhere else to go, and who had found that together they could face anything. Alara smiled, a small, private smile. The wind still blew, the land was still harsh, but the gnawing loneliness was gone. She was here. She belonged. And forever, in this quiet, resilient corner of the world, had begun.